So in November of last year, Proposition 22 passed on a referendum in California. And it's one of those things that what happens in California certainly doesn't stay in California. And this may be a problem for workers across the country because Prop 22 has created essentially a third category of workers in this country. And writing about this, the gig economy is coming for millions of American jobs. Josh Eidelson in Bloomberg has written about this extensively and where it's going. Josh, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Josh, first off, let's back up. Before we even get to Prop 22, tell us what the two categories, essentially, of work existed in this country prior to Proposition 22.
So, U.S. law at the federal level and at the state level assigns a lot of basic rights to employees and not to independent contractors. This includes things like the right to organize and unionize or protest without getting fired for it, rights against discrimination and sexual harassment, rights around minimum wage and overtime. U.S. law for decades has distinguished between contractors who ostensibly have more control over how they do their work and fewer protections, and employees who are subject to more control from their boss and have more rights in the workplace in response.
And we should say, although right now during COVID, it's a little bit different. But if I get fired from my job I'm a contractor at, I don't necessarily have the rights to go on COBRA, for instance, or I can't necessarily expect to get health insurance in the first place. I'm not getting an employer contribution to Social Security. And so, or workers' compensation, or unemployment insurance in those instances. Some of that has changed a little bit during COVID, but only on an emergency basis. So there's a multitude of like material benefits I get when I'm considered an employer, and also just rights in the workplace. What's the benefit for an employer to not make me an employee and to do what some people call misclassify?
Employers can save a lot of money and avoid a lot of liability by classifying workers as contractors rather than employees. By some estimates, it's a 30% difference when you consider costs like payroll tax. Contractors are not covered by the same minimum wage as employees, and federal law grants the right to unionize to employees and not to contractors. And in fact, federal antitrust law has been interpreted to restrict contractors from organizing collectively, even if the employer were not resisting it. And
go ahead.
Part of a larger trend in the United States, what some call the fissured workplace, where lots of Americans are finding themselves subject to rules set by companies that claim not to be those workers' employer. So that includes people who are classified as independent contractors, as well as people who might be classified as the employees of someone else, like a franchised worker at a fast food restaurant, or a subcontracted worker at a tech company, or in logistics or hospitality or wherever else, who is on paper working for a staffing company and not for the big, well-known company that they're helping to make money for.
And what's fascinating, it feels to me, and you'd have a better sense of this, so correct me if I'm wrong, that there was an increasing awareness of misclassification, where an employer would consider someone a contractor as opposed to an employee because they're avoiding all those extra expenses and all the liability and the responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And that as a political matter, there was a higher consciousness of this over the past, 5-10 years. And in some respects, Prop 22 was a response to that higher consciousness and this sort of like tightening of the misclassification?
The question of who's an employee and who's a contractor certainly goes back decades, and these fights have happened in trucking, in media, in healthcare. But with the rise of what some call the gig economy, with the attention to companies like Uber and Lyft, certainly in recent years, it has become more of a front and center political issue in the United States, this question of who's an employee or who's a contractor. And there have been efforts by some to create additional categories or broaden the definition of a contractor or allow companies to provide some benefits without being on the hook for being employers. And there have been competing efforts to expand the definition of who's an employee and make it harder for companies to claim that workers who are core to their business are not their employees. Prop 22 arose in response to a court ruling and a law in California, both of which established a standard that was much harder for companies to meet if they wanted to treat workers as contractors. Under that standard, called the ABC test, workers are generally not contractors if they're doing work that is in the general course of a company's business. And since people think of a company like Uber or Lyft, for example, as a company that provides you rides, it's a difficult situation for those companies to have to argue that they are in fact not in the business of transportation. That is something the companies argue. They say they are technology companies, not transportation companies. But it was a standard, the ABC test, that posed a threat to that business model. And after trying unsuccessfully to reach some form of compromise that would allow them to continue treating workers as contractors or not as employees, the gig companies in California together put around $200 million into this ballot measure, which designates app-based transportation and delivery drivers as contractors while creating some limited additional benefits that contractors weren't previously guaranteed in California.
So just to recap, their sort of fallback position was to spend $200 million and win this referendum to create almost a third classification of employees, if you will, or a second classification of non-employees. And so how much money, just to get a sense, how much money was spent on the opposing side of that Prop 22 referendum? Do we have a figure? Was there any?
Far less. Millions of dollars, but not hundreds of millions of dollars was spent against Prop 22. And the companies used their campaign to make ads ubiquitous in California, to argue that to keep this work around, it was necessary to pass Prop 22 and that would be beneficial to people working for these companies. The companies also deployed messages in their apps to directly contact people working on or relying on the service about Prop 22 and the benefits of it.
Now, of course, Prop 22 doesn't exist in other states around the country, but I mean, the idea that you need to create this sort of new tier of employee, if you will, or non-employee, if you will, to make your business model work suggests that maybe there's a problem with the business model. Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.